Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 64th, I believe, episode of the PB Political Podcast. I'm Eshan Pokrell.
And I'm Michael Boddicker.
And today we're back, finally, after a long time. We've been busy with school and everything else. Coming back to talk about the election of 1960, which, more than anything, I guess still has importance to this day. One, because it's JFK and Nixon, and two, because it's the start of televised debates. So, yeah, initial thoughts on 1960 before we really get into it, Boddicker?
I mean, this is a really, really interesting election. One of the more interesting ones, I would say, in the last, 75 years. Just because, one, both of these candidates actually ended up being president anyways. So this is, I think, the most recent election in which the defeated candidate did end up winning the presidency later. I suppose if there's a rematch of 2020 and Trump wins, then I guess that's not true anymore because he would be president again. But so depending on how I guess next year goes, that fact could be updated. Both of these guys, this is the first election in which the president would be born in the 20th century. Eisenhower, I think, was born in the 1880s, early 1890s. So this is the first 20th century uber modern election with modern candidates. They're younger gentlemen. I think Nixon's 46, 47, and Kennedy is 41, I believe. So these are both young guys. TV is a thing, and we'll get into that. But certainly kind of a bellwether for how the rest of, I think, the century would go.
I believe this is the only... Actually, there's two things. So one thing is kind of interesting. Of the four people standing at the top of the ticket in this election, JFK, Richard Nixon, JFK's running mate Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon's running mate Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., only Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. did not become president in his lifetime, because obviously JFK was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson ascends to the power of the presidency, and then Richard Nixon ends up being president later. So that's something kind of cool. And also, I might need to be fact-checked on this, but I think this is the only election in modern history, even, I would say, probably post-World War I, where the winner of the election did not carry a majority of the states in the Union. Richard Nixon actually carried 26 states. JFK carried 22, and 2 states went to Senator Harry Byrd from, I believe, West Virginia. But they were unpledged. They were unfaithful. They're faithless electors. But yeah, so this is actually kind of fascinating. I would agree, one of the more interesting elections in our modern times. And yeah, let's get right into it. Let's just go ahead and get into the candidates on both sides. Democratic Party first, just because they were the winning party here. JFK, a senator from Massachusetts. I guess he was going into his second term, I believe, right? He's kind of like the same timeline as President Obama, where he had a full term in the Senate. Did Obama have a full term in the Senate, or did he do 2 years? Obama.
Yeah, he did some time.
Okay, so anyways, yeah, we had JFK, and then we have a senator from Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson, probably one of the most influential politicians, at least in D.C., for how he played the game of Washington, D.C. I think everyone's somewhat familiar about him. Outside of those guys, we had a lot of senators go for the nomination. We had obviously Kennedy and Johnson both ran for it. We had Senator Stuart Symington from Missouri, Senator Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, Wayne Morse from Oregon, and George Smathers from Florida, as well as former governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, who ran for president twice by this time for the Democrats already, and got embarrassed both times. So that's this field. Kennedy. I don't really know much about the primary, I must say. Boddicker, if you want to go through it, I'll let you do it, and then we'll go to Republicans, if there's much to even cover.
Well, I mean, everybody kind of had their own candidates in this one. Like, Truman was supporting Symington, but they're both Missouri guys, so that doesn't surprise me one bit. Catholicism actually was an issue in this. Kennedy was also our first Catholic president, and that was a big issue. It was just really interesting how a lot of the factions of the Democratic Party had their own guys. Kennedy is, I would say, towards the more centrist wing of the party. You look at guys like Humphrey and Stevenson, they're much more towards the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Kennedy's much more of the, not a compromise candidate, but definitely much more of a centrist, much more of a moderate. And he's obviously got the Kennedy family name backing him. And so I think that does a lot. He did the whole "I'm not running for vice president, I'm running for president" kind of deal, which is usually pretty popular with voters, because not that voters can tell who's running for vice president, but kind of seeming serious about his actual aspirations, I think probably did him pretty well.
What's odd about this is, like, if you look at the primary map, I mean, there was not every country in the Union had a primary here. I mean, I don't know what happened exactly, but JFK, you could tell, won a lot of the northern part of the United States. He, geographically, he won Oregon, Nebraska. The most southernmost state he won was Illinois. And then we had various delegate shares in California, Florida, Ohio. So it was a strange primary. I assume most of this actually went like a little bit of a shadow primary, where you're going straight to the conventions, like the state conventions, talking to the delegates, talking to the parties, and just deciding from there. That leads us to the 1960 convention in LA, Los Angeles. This is odd too. Like, this is where Lyndon B. Johnson actually joined in. They kind of self-drafted. Adlai Stevenson and Lyndon B. Johnson went into the campaign at the convention. This is something that I guess you could not even do now. Not really, because the primaries are so big now, I guess, in American politics. You can't actually just join the. I mean, I guess you could try if there's a really split convention, but Johnson and Stephen both couldn't match Kennedy. Obviously, Kennedy's brother, future Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and Senator at some point, was leading the Kennedy campaign team. Very efficiently done campaign, and there wasn't too much drama over the convention. Kennedy was nominated on the first ballot. Kennedy asked Johnson to be his running mate, surprise people. And that's a smart move, I think, shocking to people, but also you had to get those Southern Democrats at the time.
Yep.
The Democrats were still overwhelmingly popular in the South. And, yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, although, people did not want, even Robert Kennedy himself did not actually want, or didn't think that Kennedy was going to pick Lyndon B. Johnson. Apparently, actually, Kennedy favored UAW leader, the Union, United Automobile Workers Union leader, Walter Reuther. But, yeah, Lyndon B. Johnson accepted the vice presidency. And, yeah, that's the Democratic side. Let's just quickly go to the Republicans here. Not too much different here. Richard Nixon, literally the vice president. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., he was an ambassador to the UN. Actually, I feel like he pops up a lot because of the Cold War. He's actually, I guess you would say, one of the more one of the more influential and memorable UN ambassadors we've had, I think, just because of the time. So he definitely parlayed that into something bigger. And yeah, outside of that, we also had former Senator George Bender from Ohio, State Senator James Lloyd from South Dakota, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, and I believe who became vice president for Nixon, right? Or Gerald, was it Ford? And then Cecil Underwood, governor of West Virginia, all running in the primary. So this wasn't too heated. Nixon won this easily, former vice president. And yeah, so let's get to the general. Boddicker, you got it. Yeah. Take us off.
Well, I was actually going to mention real quickly, just with the general too, I guess this goes in, kind of the party switch, kind of discussing that a little bit in terms of Southern Democrats and Democrat success in the South. I don't know where you are on the party switch, but I think it's a lot more complicated than people actually make it out to be. It's not really a cut and dry kind of deal. Like, people think that it's either like right after the New Deal, like all of the Southern Democrats switched and became Republican. That's not how it worked. Or even like after the Civil Rights Act and all that stuff, that they just switched and became Republicans. That's not really how it worked either. Like, Democrats had pretty solid success at the presidential level, or even in the state legislature level in the South, until fairly recently, mid-2000s.
I mean,
and even Alabama,
exactly.
2010, 2012 was when Republicans gained control.
The Tea Party wave was what really ended the Democratic, the full, like, the dominance of Democrats at the South. The Tea Party wave in 2010 ended that,
And which is fascinating, because not that it kind of dispels all of the party switch kind of lore, but it kind of shows that it's much more complicated than just like Southern people didn't like them. It's really complicated. Like, if you look at 1996 presidential election, Clinton won Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana. He didn't win Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, kind of the deep South, but he certainly won the kind of periphery South, which nowadays are reliably Republican almost as much as the deep South are. And even, like, Democrats had control of Alabama state legislature until very recently. And so Southern Democrats, even especially in the 1960s with Johnson, still overwhelmingly popular. And that's a generational, almost an 80-year shift in terms of political ideology. And it's complicated. So I think
you have to think that, sorry to interrupt, but, like, even, like, during Clinton's 1992 win, even though Alabama and Mississippi didn't vote for him, I believe in 1992 was Jim Folsom the governor of Alabama, a current Democratic Party member. Democrats still occupy, like, Don Siegelman was, I believe he was Secretary of State around then, or he might have been Attorney General by this point, of Alabama. So, like, Democrats had statewide offices. So, yeah, like that, even though, like, they voted Republican on the national level, they still had that. The operation was definitely very successful.
If you look at 1996, right, Bob Dole carried Alabama. He won with 50% of the vote. Bill Clinton put up 43%, which a Democrat putting up 43% in Alabama is crazy.
Only Doug Jones could do it if he won again. Yeah.
Well, and that's running against Roy Moore, the worst.
I think he could get 43 as, like, a peak. Like, I think if he had a great campaign, I think he could.
Exactly, but you're talking about a diamond.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Yeah,
dynamics, especially in the South, especially with the Democratic Party, are such a complicated affair. Like, and it has been for so long. So it's really important too to mention that when you talk about 1960, and you're wondering, you've got these, because party dynamics were much more complicated during this time, and we've talked about this before on other election podcasts. The parties weren't really split in between one conservative party and one liberal party. It was much more regional based. So you had, your Midwestern Republicans were much more moderate than your Southern Republicans, which makes sense. And you've got your liberal Republicans, up in the North, and you've got your conservative Democrats and conservative kind of Republicans down in the South. So it was much more regional based rather than, like, our national politic now, where it's like, if you're a conservative, you're in the Republican Party, and if you're liberal, you're in the Democratic Party, and if you're a moderate, you're kind of in the middle.
I think it was actually a much healthier ecosystem, because, like you said, it's all, like, I think the main driver of, like, the polarization, at least at a party level we have, is the actual DNC and the RNC, the party structure, because parties are much more top down now. I think even in the 60s, like, you were like, if you're a Democrat in the 60s, you're attracting, no matter where you are, you're attracting poor voters, you're attracting working class voters, but you're like, everything, that's, like, the only base you really have. Everything else is up to where you're from, what the tie, like, what you're actually trying to work for your state or your region.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can really, like, see. Like, even, like, because, like, Republicans, in the 1800s, Republicans were the party of the working class, and it kind of started switching during the Great Depression, I feel like, when, like, that power started concentrating in, like, New York and even, like, California. So it's like, I think having much less structured party platforms led to a much healthier, a much healthier ecosystem electorally. I mean, the 1960 election, 63.8% turnout. I don't know if this counts black voters, because, obviously we still had, the Civil Rights Act hadn't passed, the Voting Rights Act hadn't passed yet. So I don't know if this counts. I don't know if the turnout rates count there, but the turnout was high. Obviously, we had 67% in 2020, very high number relatively. But yeah, I think that's definitely the biggest. I would say party structures are honestly the biggest driver of polarization in today's country.
Well,
and that's
If you look at it, right, it makes so much sense, because during this time, right, you didn't have to have the if you were running for Senate, right, in New Hampshire, you would run that campaign a lot differently than you would running for Senate in Alabama.
Exactly.
The same party, a Republican in New Hampshire versus a Republican in Alabama, you have to run different campaigns. And I think they understood that at the time. You didn't have to be an Eisenhower Republican. Yes, you kind of did have to be an Eisenhower Republican, but that could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, and also you weren't actually. So this is the other problem is if you're running for any party primary in a high race like Senate, you're really campaigning to the RNC or the DNC. You're trying to get the money that they have in their funds to help fund your campaign. So that kind of just forces you to take. And I mean, this isn't blaming the candidates. I mean, you have to do. I mean, if you're wanting to win and serve your state, you're gonna do what you can to get there, obviously. But that just kind of forces your messaging and what you're actually talking about to become much more nationalized and more I would say divisive too, and make it much more inflammatory. When I think Katie Britt actually did a good job of this. I feel like she ran a much more localized campaign, and she just kind of won off the fact that her only challenger was Mo Brooks, who most of the state really dislikes, and probably most of the country kind of dislikes. The only county that Mo Brooks won was Madison County, and that was only in the first primary. He barely won it, and that's his home county. And she did a very localized campaign. She went to every county multiple times. She was just going to random places. I think that was, as she stayed out of the national topics. I don't know if you saw, I guess you were in DC, but a lot of the ads you would see would be the grocery taxes. That's a big contention in Alabama, eliminating the grocery tax. Things like that, schools, stuff like that.
Well, and it's a huge difference, especially between 1960 and now, and tying it back into the old election. You had to run campaigns far differently, because I think they were much better at understanding the region that they were in. That's why the Susan Collinses of the world are so rare nowadays, because it's hard to run as something like that and still get support from the national.
Exactly.
Susan Collins is one of the more liberal Republicans. She's center to center left, you could even argue, but she does, I guess, vote with the party on some important stuff, some stuff. She has no problem breaking with the party, or the Joe Manchins of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's much harder to run a different structure like that nowadays, when you have to take into account all of the different factors and the party centralization and all sorts of other stuff that we've talked about. And so in this time, you're talking about, you've got a more conservative leaning Democrat from the South in Johnson, and then you've got you've got your your liberals from Illinois or Minnesota, and so those are entirely different branches of the Democratic Party. And you can still make the argument now that they're the Democrats in the South that are more conservative than the Democrats in the North, and that's true. But by and large, I think that there are still broad agreements, whereas I'm sure Hubert Humphrey and LBJ in 1960 had very different opinions on the Civil Rights Act, and they're in the same party, and on such an important issues like segregation. Whereas now it would be very different. Yeah,
and let's go ahead and segue into one. It's interesting stuff. I mean, let's talk about probably the biggest. I would say the biggest the biggest thing that the 1960 election has kept to this day, televised debates. So this is the first time we've had televised debates in I believe televised debates. We've had radio debates since the Lincoln years, all the way back in the 1860s, obviously with the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, but here we have actual televised debates. And this actually, a lot of people credit Kennedy's win due to these televised debates. Obviously, if you've been through any American history class, you tend to hear how Kennedy always ended up looking better on TV. Nixon was always sweating and like kind of nervous and always a little shifty. Nixon was just kind of like that, little kind of a paranoid individual, as you could see from his administration. But while a lot of people and the thing is, the fascinating thing is, I think a lot of people kind of believe that Nixon had the better messaging, at least like on like a populist level. Like people actually thought Nixon had a better message, but when you put TV into the equation, because it's always like people always say like on the radio people say Nixon won, on the TV it's overwhelmingly that Kennedy won, right? Because Kennedy came off as like the much more relaxed, much more confident and cool candidate. And yeah, they had 4 debates. They had one in Chicago, one in Washington D.C., one in Los Angeles, or one where they were filmed in different places. So Los Angeles for Nixon, home state of California, and Kennedy in New York City, where he wasn't his home state, but obviously the Kennedy family's a lot of ties to New York City. And then the last one in New York City as well. So yeah, I mean, just off the bat, like the imprint of televised debates is obviously still going. Hopefully we get televised debates. They've been set up for this 2024 election. There's no guarantee either party wants to send their candidate to a potential 3-way debate. But yeah, I mean, like, do you have like anything to just start us off with on the debates themselves?
Well, I believe it was the first debate that Kennedy won pretty easily, and not that the first debate is the only one that matters, but a lot of people are going to watch that first one, and it kind of helps them make their mind up.
66.4 million people in 1960
recover from that first loss, because I think it was the second one that Nixon is pretty agreed upon to have won. But when you've got that first one that he kind of laid an egg, it's hard to recover. And when you look at the margins in some of these states, kind of segueing into the results, I mean, it was significant. I mean, he wins some of these states at a close margin, and he wins. Like, Nixon loses in Delaware. I know it's only 3 electoral votes, but he loses by 3,000 votes. He loses by 9,000 votes in Illinois, which is 27 electoral votes. He loses by 60,000 votes in Michigan. He loses by 30,000 votes in Minnesota. He loses by 10,000 votes in Missouri. He loses by 20,000 votes in New Jersey. He loses, by 60,000 votes in North Carolina. Loses by a little over 120,000 in Pennsylvania. Loses by 10,000 in South Carolina. Loses by 50,000 in Texas. And so, his margins were really, really close, and could have definitely turned a lot of the tide in that election. So kind of showing that the debates matter. The TV, the changing of, what do these guys look like? How do they perform? How do they show under pressure? I think that's a big thing that we look for in candidates now, is how are they able to talk on TV? It's not just what they say, but how they're saying it. That's important. And that showed here. And this one was really close, honestly. It's much closer. It's like kind of like 2016, and even, I guess, 2020 in a way, where the state margins, maybe the electoral votes kind of made it look like it wasn't that close, but the state margins show that it was way closer than people think.
And I mean, we still don't know. I mean, it's very possible, due to some discrepancies in the vote in Alabama and in Georgia and Mississippi. We don't actually, because of just the way they did the primaries there, or the general election, we don't know if Nixon actually could have won the popular vote and lost the election. There's actually still controversy around that. I want to mention one thing about the debates. The format for these debates is so much better than anything we're going to see probably ever again, honestly, unfortunately. Let me just go through the format here. So 8-minute opening statements for both candidates. Each question, you had a 2.5-minute response with an optional rebuttal and a 3-minute closing statement. So very standard opening, questions, closing. But the sheer amount of time you have, and also the audience capture. Obviously, the attention spans for people were much higher back then. This is actually like a great way. This is probably the way you should have a presidential debate. And obviously, both of these men obviously were very. Let's just say President Biden and President Trump would not probably do well in this. I don't think they have the temperament, especially President Trump, just because of how he is during debates. I don't think that they'd have the temperament to have a debate as calm and as just as focused and driven as this. I don't think anybody, honestly, probably most people. I feel like President Obama could do it just because he's the ultimate statesman, and maybe even Senator Romney maybe, which is kind of ironic because they ran for president, they had the election, but yeah, this format is worlds away from what we have now. I believe now we have 1 minute opening statements, and then we barely get responses to questions, no rebuttal. It's like a mess. So this I wanted to mention the format, at least for the first one. I think that was a great and it's different for each one. So I think it was great that they had such different. You got to see so many different perspectives and situations for both candidates. Do you want to go ahead and get into the results here in one of the closest elections in the time? Yeah, let's get into it. So Kennedy obviously ends up the winner. Electorally, he wins 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219. Again, Kennedy ended up really only winning. If you look at the map, Kennedy only won 3 states west of the Mississippi River. It's actually one of the most interesting the state divides. I haven't actually seen a state divide as odd as that. Now that I think about it, Kennedy won Texas, he won Nevada, and he won New Mexico, and he won... No, that was actually Byrd. So he won 3 states west of the Mississippi River, total of 31 electoral votes. Everything else was east. It's actually... Yeah, this is such an interesting map. I know you're probably looking at it too right now. Yeah. But again, Nixon won 26 states. Kennedy only won 22. That's very interesting to me. And obviously 2 states went to... Senator Byrd or Governor Byrd, what was he? Senator Byrd of Virginia. His son was Harry Byrd. My bad. Yeah. So interesting results. Kennedy did win the popular vote, but just barely. He won it by 0.17%, with 49.72% of the vote to Nixon's 49.55. Again, that one. So the Alabama popular vote issue is just because I'll run through this real quick. This is a lot more procedural than we'd probably want to get into. So voters in Alabama were instead of voting for a candidate, they were voting for the electors. So they were voting for 11 people on the electoral to be their electoral college representatives rather than voting for the people themselves. So it's a little odd. So here, I guess the thought is that you'd vote for either the Democratic or the Republican elector, and the top 11 would be your electors to electoral college, right? It's a little confusing. That's the reason we don't know exactly the popular vote, is because there's a lot of discrepancy on how this was actually counted. In the end, Senator Byrd ended up getting 6 votes out of Alabama. Is it 6? I believe it's 6. And yeah, so there's a lot of mess going on there. I think Mississippi just ended up voting for for Byrd. I don't think it was I think it was just Mississippi voting for him. Right? They didn't have the same system as us. So yeah, general election results. Do you have anything to remark on?
I mean, of course, I mentioned that Kennedy won a lot of close states. Nixon did too. He won Alaska by 1,000 votes. He won California by 35,000 votes, and that's his home state as well. He won Florida by 45,000 votes. There were a lot of really close states. There were, not a lot of blowouts in this election. The most uncompetitive state that Kennedy won was Rhode Island, and he won 63-36. That's a blowout, but I guess by modern standards, that's probably not that much. And Nixon had the same thing, kind of a 62-38. So the fact that nobody got 70% in a state is pretty fascinating. And the fact that it was really and those were two kind of outliers, that most of it was either 60-40 or even closer. 55-45, and those margins are really tight, considering the amount of safe states we have now that just aren't in play. California is not going to be in play. New York's not going to be in play. Illinois is not going to be in play. A lot of the solid Republican states of now are not in play. Your North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, South Carolina, Wyoming, Montana at the presidential level is not in play. Idaho, Kentucky.
Look at in 1960, two things. California went to Nixon by just 35,000 votes, his home state of California, and Hawaii went to Kennedy by 115 votes. It's crazy. Yeah. The margins in Hawaii, 92,410 for Kennedy, 92,295 for Nixon. A .06% swing, or a 0.03% swing in Hawaii. That's crazy stuff. You would never see margins like this in a lot of the country. And I think that's just due to the regional. It has to be due to the regional methoding, how politics worked back then. Much more regional. You obviously couldn't be. I guess maybe in the '60s you could, but I don't think you'd be campaigning in Iowa in the morning and going to, I don't know, Texas at night. I don't think you could really do that in the '60s. So it's just.
Let me pull out the trusty Apple calculator here. All right, because if you look at the math, right, Kennedy had plus 13 plus 8 plus 27 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 plus 3. 61. Kennedy had 61 electoral votes that he won by under 10,000 votes.
It might be, yeah. I mean, that might be
if my math is mathing correctly, that takes him down to 242 and takes Nixon up to 280. 269 is the margin because DC doesn't vote yet. So 269 is the margin. Nixon would have 280, and that wins the presidential election.
Now, is that closer than 2020, where we had, I believe, 37,000 votes decide, 5-6 states?
I mean, yeah.
It's much closer. Never mind, it's much closer. I mean, the closest state.
28,000. It's like 35,000.
Yeah,
votes.
The closest state in 2020 was Georgia, which was decided by 11,000 votes. Arizona was second with 10,000. Wisconsin was third with 20,000. So, yes, closer than 2020. Probably less divisive than 2020, I must say. Although, and we'll get into the Kennedy. We'll touch on the Kennedy administration because I need to get out of here, unfortunately. But yeah, Kennedy wasn't the government was not a friend of John F. Kennedy, is what we'll say. Obviously, he was very anti-escalation in the Cold War, which you would assume most people were at. The average American was at. Obviously,
Bay of proceeded to escalate a little bit.
He did proceed to escalate a little bit. Obviously, famously, Bay of Pigs. The military tried to go into Cuba. He was very against the invasion. It went poorly. Kennedy got the blame. I think Kennedy's been vindicated recently. I think a lot of the energy has become more American invasive. Like how what's happened in Central America, and obviously, objectively, that is. A lot of the ruins are due to the American policies in this time. But Kennedy opposed all of this. He was I would say for that reason, he was very popular among young people. Not to say young people were voting, but he was very popular for his foreign policy stances. Obviously created the Peace Corps. Big, I guess, point of his administration. Very foreign policy heavy administration, I would say. I mean, obviously it was only 3 years long, but I would say that honestly, his foreign policy is what he's remembered for most. I think would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna make maybe a crazy comparison here.
Good.
So tell me if I'm stupid, but I think that Kennedy kind of has the same, not same legacy, but same kind of reverence in a way, and as Reagan.
I think so.
There are a lot of parallels to draw between Kennedy and Reagan in terms of the way that they were able to use language effectively to market themselves and their ideas, especially regarding foreign policy, like ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And kind of the parallels with, the great communicator Reagan in terms of the way that he used language to get people to get behind him. Again, their foreign policies, escalatory to an extent with the Soviet Union. These massive projects that they wanted to undertake. So Kennedy, we choose to go to the moon. Reagan, Star Wars.
Yeah, I completely forgot about the moon.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kennedy and Reagan have a lot of similarities in terms of the way that they went about being president.
Yeah. I think so too.
That's probably been a good thing for their legacies, is just their ability to kind of market themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, Kennedy was a huge proponent of civil rights too. I mean, it was interesting. He tended to try to stay out of it at like the presidential level, but a lot of policy, especially his executive order post was it James Meredith, the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, for all of us Southerners. He signed an executive order. I forgot what the number is, but it basically prohibited discrimination in housing and federal housing and related facilities. I think he definitely would. I would call. I know Johnson gets a lot of press for positive for Great Society. There's obviously critiques of that now, but like I think Kennedy was definitely ahead of his time. Obviously, he kind of paved the way for the Civil Rights Act in legislative form, at least. Not saying that he obviously, he came in Alabama for the schoolhouse doors when Governor Wallace was blocking the doorway. So I think that's probably his biggest legacy, I would say, at the domestic level. Of course, with the moon, which I completely forgot about the space program. I don't know how I forgot about that. And obviously, we got to see that come to fruition after his death. Let's say, and obviously he was assassinated in Dallas, unfortunately, but do you think that if he had ended up serving 2 terms, do you think we would have seen RFK become president after? What do you think would have happened in a fully alive Kennedy?
That's assuming that both of them don't get assassinated.
Yes. Let's say Kennedy.
Because that's not only assuming that JFK doesn't.
Yeah, let's say Kennedy survives his term. I think he would have ended up as one of the more popular presidents in American history. I think he still is one of the most popular presidents in American history. But I think he did a lot of stuff. I think he had one of the more heavy terms, as in like he did a dense term, despite being 3 years too long. But let's say he serves 2 terms. One, where do you think let's just, in general, where do you think he ranks? And also, do you think RFK would have continued the Kennedy legacy?
I think it's entirely possible. I think Kennedy ranks, it's tough because he didn't serve full term, but I really do think he's probably he's at least a top half, probably a top 15. You could put him in your top 10, depending on how you feel. But I like him. I think that he did a lot of good things, especially towards the end of his life, especially with civil rights. Did a lot of good things there. He had a good way with words. I respect him a lot, and I think he generally would have been a pretty effective leader had he finished his first term, and then he would have definitely won re-election for a second term. And so I also think that a successful Kennedy administration would have kind of changed the political dynamic. Like, maybe we wouldn't have had Reagan without Kennedy, or even like, the Nixon Ford era, the Republican like late 60s, mid 70s. If Kennedy survives, and you would assume that a Democrat would succeed him more likely than not, unless I guess they're around Hubert Humphrey again.
I think it would have been RFK. I mean, he was Attorney General at the time. I think they would have.
George McGovern.
Maybe George McGovern, but I think McGovern would have done better. I don't know. That's McGovern's. Yeah, that's the whole thing.
That was a disaster. What are you doing, National Democrats? That was an idiot. That was a stupid move.
Yeah. I think Kennedy.
Kennedy did also, though. He did also agree to wiretap Martin Luther King Jr.'s phone.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely, obviously, there's issue. I think Kennedy. I give him top 10 just because, like, I think we haven't had a president like Kennedy in the sense that we haven't had like a young president who's like been like as. I think Kennedy's like name, like the idea of like the Kennedy presidency is kind of like a very like idealistic thing that Americans look back on, even if we weren't alive, obviously. But we're like, oh, this is actually possible. You can have a 40-year-old president. And I don't think anyone that's ran for president, obviously, has been able to catch that magic again.
I mean, Bill Clinton was...
He was pretty young. He was relatively young. But I think that it's just, like, something that, like, people can... It provided a point for people to look back and be like, oh, we've had Kennedy, you know, we've had this before. And, I mean, it went fairly well. He didn't get us into nuclear war. And I think at that anything like that was a win. And actually, I think he exceeded expectations, honestly. Considering it seemed that the whole military-industrial complex was against him, obviously. Well, I'm not going to say obviously, but his death is suspicious. I'm going to say that. I think everybody agrees with that. It's kind of weird that no one's released the full files on that. I know RFK Jr., who's running for president right now, has actively been trying to get that done. Maybe he will.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know. Well, I mean, yeah. Kennedy's an interesting one, but...
Well, Kennedy has kind of we have a lot to thank for him in Huntsville, especially what he did for space policy.
Absolutely.
And the arsenal. Werner von Braun, shout out Werner von Braun. He's not too popular nowadays.
Shout out Werner von Braun.
I am unabashed.
Shout out his mind. Shout out to Werner von Braun's mind.
Shout out to his mind.
Engineering genius.
I am unabashedly in support of Werner von Braun.
Yeah, so I mean, like that's yeah.
There's a lot of good things to take out of Kennedy's presidency. So. He wasn't perfect. No president is.
Yep.
No president will be.
I agree.
But certainly a trendsetter for sure, and a young president. And we haven't really had one. I mean, we've had Bill Clinton. George Bush wasn't too old, but certainly none that people were like fears of his inexperience.
Yeah. Clinton was 46 about when he won the election in 1992. Yes, he was 46 when he 46 when he won the election. So, yeah, but I mean, Clinton can still run for president now. In theory, he's younger than President Biden.
And Trump. He'd be the youngest candidate.
He'd be the youngest candidate. Well, he's not younger than RFK if we're counting him as a major candidate. Yeah, as of now, yeah.
Major party candidate.
But anyways, that's the episode. We're probably gonna be out for the next couple weeks just due to like the finals week and the break. But we will be back before the new year. We'll do probably a couple more of these, and we're gonna start getting into. We're gonna try to finish this up. We're gonna get to 2020, but primaries are coming up, caucuses are coming up. We're going to do maybe we'll do a debate episode this week if it's good. But hopefully we'll be sending some representatives to the debate in Tuscaloosa. Definitely sending one, so that'll be fun. But yeah, y'all. Thank y'all for listening. Go to the website. Good articles coming out. We just had a pretty in-depth article about special elections and also about President Biden. That just came out. President Biden and his re-election bid. So, yeah. Like, comment, subscribe. Share this with y'all's friends. Go to the Instagram. Go to the website. I'm Eshan Pokral.
And I'm Michael Boddicker.
And goodbye.